Hey there, everyone. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology with yet another question and answer segment where practicing astrologers bring me their questions and I provide them answers based on my astrological practice.
The other day, I was in an event where someone was talking about Virgo and they related it to the idea of service. And I thought that was part of the old astrological alphabet. So I'm interested in your opinion as to whether or not that's really a valid connection.
Okay, so the question has to do with the connection between Virgo and service and where that comes from. I'm going to tell you all the story, and you have to promise me that you're not going to tell this story to anybody else. I'm probably not supposed to be telling this story, which is why my voice is now doing strange things. But in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, there was an astrologer. I'm not going to call anybody's name because it will never be said in this astrological kingdom that Bryan sat down on his Oraculos podcast and called people's names in a disparaging way. But there was an astrologer who was faced with a very specific challenge. This person was surrounded by a world of weekend long certification programs. Because back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the weekend long certification program was a huge hit where you could just leave your home, go to a cabin for the weekend, and come back certified as who knows, whatever you wanted to be. You could leave home on Friday morning as an accountant and come back on Sunday evening as a shaman. So there were all of these weekend long spiritual certification programs happening, and people wanted to figure out how to teach astrology in a similar way. Now, you have to realize astrology is not a simple subject. Astrology is not a subject you can learn in a weekend. As astrologers, we measure our lives based on years, not hours. And so, this notion or this idea of giving someone a comprehensive astrological education in a weekend is absurd, which is why we have no certification programs for a weekend at Oraculos, because it literally makes no sense whatsoever that you can impart a comprehensive body of information that somebody is going to start using as far as astrology is concerned, and that they will have sufficient grasp of that information to begin doing that with other people professionally. It makes no sense whatsoever. You cannot learn astrology in a weekend. Astrology is a very difficult thing. It is a highly complicated skill. It is a highly complicated language. There is no learning astrology in a weekend. And I really hope I'm being clear about that, because people, especially in these centuries of 21, have this idea and have this concept that you can study online for like a month and then call yourself an astrologer. And then they turn around and they start calling people, and I'm not even going to say the next thing because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but there's another word that, okay, I'll say it. Astrologist is not a word. Astrologist is not a word. We need to stop saying astrologist just as much as we need to stop saying astrological consult, because we don't give astrological consults, we give astrological consultations. Astrologist is not a word. And I met someone recently, wonderful, loving, kind, huge-hearted person who who said to me, I go to other places that aren't just astrology places, just FYI. I do tend to want to have like a social life. So I went out on the weekend and I met someone, and he was like, "Oh man, it's so cool to meet another astrologist." And it completely, I don't really have a poker face either, so I can only imagine what my face looks like in that moment, because astrologist is not a word. Please stop using it. Also, please stop using astrological consult. We don't give consults, we give astrological consultations. Now that I've gotten that off of my chest, you can't learn astrology in a weekend. However, it didn't stop people from trying to teach astrology in a weekend. So this person decided that they would create what is called the 12-letter astrological alphabet. And in this 12-letter astrological alphabet, we ended up with this idea that Aries equals Mars equals the first house. So anything that could be said about Aries could also be said about Mars, could also be said about the first house. Taurus equaled Venus equaled the second house, which means anything that could be said about Taurus also could be said about our money and our relationship to money in our charts, which means whatever house cusp you find Taurus on within your natal chart is going to be the house that you make money from. I shit you not. We also had this happening with Gemini and Mercury and the third house. And ultimately, this also happened with Cancer and the Moon and the fourth house, which is why we have a whole bag of astrologers running around thinking that the fourth house has to do with the mother, when in fact the fourth house has never had to do with the mother in 4,000 years of astrological history. And we know this because from a philosophical perspective, when we apply the Chaldean order to the 12 houses, we get the first house corresponding with Saturn, because Saturn represents the physical realities of my physical body, as does the first house. We get the second house corresponding with Jupiter, because Jupiter corresponds with abundance and money, as well as the warmth of my brother's, not my brother, but as well as the warmth of my mother's breast milk, as does the second house, because the second house corresponds with money and food in traditional astrology. We get Mars corresponding with the third house, because the third house has to do with our brethren, our siblings, our blood relations, as well as our short pilgrimages or journeys, in the same way that Mars has to do with our brethren, our siblings, our blood relationships, as well as our short pilgrimages or journeys. And finally, if we apply the Chaldean order to the 12 houses, we get the Sun corresponding with the fourth house, because the fourth house is the house of our Father. Period. And because modern astrology has never had this understanding, we continue to learn in astrological spaces that the fourth house has to do with our mother, because of this one tiny demonic seed that was planted that says that the fourth house corresponds with Cancer, corresponds with the moon, corresponds with the mother, corresponds with the fourth house. We don't practice demonism at the Oraculos School of Astrology, and as a result of that, we do not teach that the fourth house corresponds with the mother, because we have a larger traditional astrological understanding that makes us realize that based on the philosophy of all astrology, that just shouldn't be the case. So, by extrapolation, we end up with the fifth house corresponding with Leo, corresponding with the sun, corresponding with our children, which is why we have this big relationship between Leo and children and childbirth within modern astrology as well, which is kind of crazy because Leo is a barren sign as far as traditional astrology is concerned, and the sun definitely is also a planet that has no relationship at all to the proliferation of childbirth. And particularly within traditional astrology, having either the sun or Mars in the fifth house is an affliction to the fifth house, because the sun and Mars are hot and dry, and therefore they burn up the moisture necessary to support the seed within the womb of the pregnant woman. And so the sun and Mars collectively are considered to be malefic from the perspective of their presence within the fifth house. So all of this being said, from a traditional perspective, we see why there shouldn't be a relationship necessarily between the sun, Leo, or the fifth house, but modern astrology does not understand these nuances, and therefore the sun equals the fifth house equals Leo equals my children. Finally, if we continue to apply this, we end up with Virgo equaling Mercury equaling my sixth house equaling service. The service thing came up because people didn't like to talk about slavery. I don't like to talk about slavery, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to recreate 4,000 years of astrological history. Well, actually 2,000 years of astrological history, because we don't necessarily have this concept of the houses going back 4,000 years, but we do know that at least they've been present within at least 2,000 years of our astrological practice. Be that as it may, the point of the matter is I'm not going to recreate 2,000 years of astrological history just because I don't like to say the S word of slavery. So the sixth house does represent slavery. It has always represented slavery. It will always represent slavery. Because of me and my own relationship to the word slavery, I've chosen to change the word slavery to the word stress. However, it carries the same connotation that the sixth house is a house of stress slash slavery. Now, this idea of service was meant to soften some of the blow surrounding the sixth house in the same way as the word subconscious was meant to soften some of the blow surrounding the self undoing and the hidden enemies that we find within our 12th house. But there is something that happens when we start to rebuild astrology in our own image. What happens is we lose a lot of the potent heritage surrounding various concepts that we find within our astrological corpus. I am a blazing homosexual black man in the year 2023, and the astrology that I practice doesn't necessarily have a context for that experience. So when I practice horary astrology and I see that in a horary chart regarding love, the sun represents the man and the Venus represents the woman, what do I do in terms of my blazing homosexual experience? I probably don't use that part of horary astrology within the context of casting a horary chart about my own love life. Because in my own love life, Venus will never represent the woman. And therefore, there is no context for that experience within my traditional understanding of horary astrology. But I don't need to change what horary astrology is because me, as a homosexual, haven't been able to find a version of that experience for myself within traditional astrology. Because the reality is that the astrology is still going to point towards the realities of my love life and the specificities of my love life. And the ruler of the ascendant in the horary chart is going to refer to me. And the ruler of my seventh house in the horary chart is going to refer to my partner, regardless of what gender my partner might be. So, astrology as it is big enough to hold everything about us, even if there are specific specificities about our own experience that don't necessarily fall within the larger context of traditional astrology. And I don't necessarily agree with the rewriting of traditional astrology in order to fit our 2023 narrative of what life should be. Because as intelligent human beings, we have the ability to see something and read something that was written 400 years ago and figure out how we're going to apply that to our lives, but we don't need to ask a book that was written 400 years ago to change its languaging. There's also this notion in medieval astrology that if a man has Venus angular and in hard aspect within his chart, he's going to be a sodomite, which basically means he's going to be a homosexual. Now, I haven't done the whole angular afflicted Venus study to know if that's the truth, but I've lived enough life to know that that can't possibly be the truth. And I've also lived enough life to know that based on the medieval period, that was something that was greatly frowned upon, whereas in the 21st century, in the year 2023, it technically isn't. So the point to the matter is that astrology is what it is, in much the same way as reading a book by a classical author that we still love, even if there were things within that book that might be a little bit challenging or a little bit edgy for us exists within that book, we can still appreciate the larger context of what we're reading, even if we don't necessarily subscribe to all of the worldviews of the people who wrote that book. There is, on this note, and I know that I'm supposed to be talking about the Virgo and the whatever, but I'm going to get back to that. On this note, there is an astrologer by the name of C.C. Zane, who was one of the most prominent figures of the medical astrology revival in the early 1930s and 40s. And when you buy the literature of C.C. Zane or the literature of the Brotherhood of Light today, it comes with a disclaimer that says, hey, we haven't actually changed anything that he wrote within this book, but we do want to apologize for some of the insensitivities that are in this book because he was a product of white America in the 1940s. So there are things within that book that aren't necessarily falling within the most politically correct context, but it's a brilliant book. The writings of C.C. Zane are brilliant writings. Similarly, within the Kabbalistic world, we have the writings of Dion Fortune. And within Dion Fortune's writings, her book, The Mystical Kabbalah, the people who have republished that work have put a disclaimer at the front of the book as well to say that she might say things in this book that are racially insensitive, and she might also say things that are a product of the fact that she too was moving within the world within the 1940s, and therefore this book was written based on her experiences as a white woman in that era. And so the point of what I'm saying is that there's a lot within traditional astrology that wouldn't be politically correct within the 21st century. Going to your horary astrologer to see whether or not the woman is doing it with another man other than you isn't necessarily politically correct within the 21st century, but it was something that was done routinely within traditional astrology. That doesn't mean that we should throw the entire baby of traditional astrology out with the bathwater, but it does say that there are some things that were probably more relevant at certain periods of our human history, not just at certain periods of our astrological history, but at certain periods of our human history, because astrology has only ever reflected the larger zeitgeist of the period within which it was built. And as far as we're practicing traditional astrology, that means that we're at least practicing astrology that can be rooted in the 17th century and before. And to that end, all of us who practice traditional astrology are going to have to figure out what aspects of our traditional practice are worth reviving in the 21st century and what aspects aren't necessarily worth reviving within the 21st century. Now, this modern concept that Virgo has something to do with the sixth house is completely a modern concept, and the only place we find this within our larger traditional astrological corpus is as far as medical astrology is concerned, in which we do find the parts of the body that correspond with Virgo, such as the small intestines, the large intestines, and the lower pelvic organs in general. Those parts of the body do correspond with the sixth house in the same way as they correspond with Virgo. But that's the only place in traditional Western tropical astrology that we find this correspondence between the sign of the zodiac and the house that corresponds with the number of that sign of the zodiac. But we don't find this larger extension of one giving the signs of the zodiac a meaning, such as saying that Virgo has to do with service, and then superimposing that on the house that Virgo corresponds with numerically. So, in answering this question, I would say that this is a habit that has no root within astrology beyond the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And I think as people who practice a tradition that's over 4,000 years old, we have to decide within ourselves where we want to derive the majority of our astrological understanding from. Do you want to derive the majority of your astrological understanding in the year 1989, when we have books that go as far back as the 9th century and earlier that actually give us far more of a philosophical basis for the astrology that we practice? You probably don't. Or probably you do, because maybe you feel as if you want to be on the cutting edge of the future, but within the context of astrology, there is no cutting edge of the future without firmly understanding the roots of our classical astrological heritage. And unfortunately, and I don't even think it's unfortunate, but fortunately, it behooves all of us as astrologers to understand astrology from a traditional perspective, whether or not we are traditional astrologers. And a big part of that has to do with transmission of information. We have to know where the information came from, where the information is right now, and what the impact of that information will be 7 generations from now, because we at this moment are at the cutting edge of a major astrological revival. And in order for us to truly revive astrology in a way that is representative of astrology itself, we must all, every single one of us, it doesn't matter if you're an evolutionary astrologer, karmic astrologer, white witch astrologer, astrologer in the dark, astrologer in the daylight, any type of astrologer you are, you have to commit yourself to at least understanding. Do a course in the foundations of classical astrology. Buy the books that represent the foundations of classical astrology, because we have to know where things come from. Because only by knowing where things come from can we understand our relationship to the things that we currently say, do, and practice within our modern astrological context. And if we understand the deep philosophical and metaphysical basis of the houses, there's no way that we'll ever say that Virgo, Mercury, and the sixth house correspond with each other, because we would realize that there is a life that the houses have that only corresponds with the houses. There's a life that the signs have that only corresponds with the signs. And there's a life that the planets have that only correspond with those planets. And we need to understand the houses on their own term without trying to simplify the houses doctrine so that we can understand astrology more easily. Because when you try to do that with a language, you'll fail. There is no way of simplifying Spanish in a way that allows you to understand it more easily. You have to understand the rules of Spanish. So why do we try to simplify the astrology and all of the nuance and the texture and the complexity of astrology in order for us to understand how to practice it more easily? I would much rather learn astrology as the difficult, mind-shattering practice that it is than trying to learn astrology simply in a simplified, dumbed down version, which actually does dumb down how we interact with the astrology as well. And interacting with astrology by saying that Leo equals my fifth house equals my sun equals my children is a very dumb way to interact with astrology in any century, because it flattens this rich and this deeply philosophically textured understanding of the houses and what they represent, of the signs and what they correspond with, and of the planets and what they represent, in a way that isn't really, I want to say, it's not really forgivable. And it's not really forgivable. It really isn't forgivable, because you would never do that to a language. You could never do that to Portuguese. You could never do that to Spanish. You could never do that to Hebrew, because you won't be able to speak those languages. So why do we think we can do it to astrology and still be able to speak astrology well, when we've flattened all of the nuance and all of the complexity that exists when we practice in that way? So there is no relationship between Virgo, Mercury, and the sixth house, in the same way as there is no relationship between Pisces, Jupiter, and the 12th house. These relationships don't exist. And if we're going to practice good astrology, we need to practice by understanding that everything in astrology is a complete, hermetically sealed unit of information by itself, and we have to unfold all of those lids in order for us to understand the astrology in a deeper, more nuanced way.
The other day when it came up in a situation, I didn't hear you say, no, you can't connect Virgo with service. So then I needed to hear that again, I guess.
I'm actually going to put a ban at Oraculos. That there is no more talking about the signs of the zodiac at Oraculos, because it's a pandemic. You know, this overemphasis on the signs of the zodiac is a pandemic, and it hurts me. It breaks my heart when I see flesh of my flesh also engaging with astrology in that way. So stay tuned for the changes that occur.
Thank you, Mychal.
If you're enjoying these Q&A segments and you'd like to work with either myself or an OSA certified astrologer, then by all means check out our website, where you can book yourself a high-quality astrological consultation today. Also, I answer many of these questions and more in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, A Depth of Beginning in the Celestial Art, which you can buy a copy of on Amazon.com.